Okay, so this is going to be fairly short presentation, basically fairly short recording around database administration. We talked a bit about, we've talked a lot about the design, the structure. Database administration is really how do you run this stuff? How do you keep it going with the types of things that you need to if you're going to set up a database and work with it, the types of things that have to be done in terms of tasks um, to set it up and to keep it running. All right. So there's a couple of things we're looking at. So the care and feeding of a database of a production database is kind of we look at this idea of what we call auditing. All right. So really, we want to make sure that it's working. It's working the way we want it to work. We want to make sure that it's recoverable. We want to make sure that it will, the answers that we're getting are correct. All right. So there's a whole bunch of different mechanisms that are baked into the DBMS. So the DBMS has this stuff baked in it. So you don't have to, the good news is we don't have to go back and write it ourselves. We don't have to write systems. The downside is you don't get it for, you don't necessarily get things automatically. All right. So what happens is things have to be set up and activated and run. So they've automated a lot of stuff, but it still has things have to be set up correctly in order to get what you want to do. All right. So this idea of any other system. So and this is not necessarily unique to databases. It's also with any type of computer or network resource. All right, so it's the same thing. So there's a set of things we need to do. All right. So like one thing we talk about is this idea of update and access control. We have to define the rules to say who can get to the system, what can they do. All right. You know, you set these things up. You want to protect the data that's in it, not necessarily let anybody do whatever they want on whatever terms. So this idea of updating access control is important. Um, we want to make sure that we coordinate it. This stuff it's a shared resource that it's one party or one thing is not consuming 100% and everybody else has to wait. All right, because the database is we're talking these distributed systems notwithstanding, it's a concentration of resources. All right? So one of the things we have to do is when we have this concentration, we have to make sure that the physical systems are secure. We're going to make sure that we whatever we put in there around performance or things like indexes, going to make sure they're secure. You make sure there's no possibility of someone coming in either accessing data or changing the data structures. All right, and the way so there's a big emphasis around database administration around setting the rules of who can do what to when, do what to who to where, and being able to manage that and be able to enforce that. In addition, what happens is when you set up a database and the database is operating, the expectation is that it's working. It's going to be there when organization needs to do it. Most modern organizations run their systems 24/7. It becomes the central nervous system of the operation. So the organization dependence on this stuff means one of the most important things you need to do is making sure things are being backed up, and you've got and you have tools and techniques that can let you recover it in case there's a problem. All right. Nothing worse than having a organization on a global organization running on a system 24/7, and then have that system stop working. So databases, definition here is perform to restore data if to be able to be able to create a copy of the data can be restored if something becomes corrupted or lost. This is one of the main functions the database administrator does. There's techniques, there's capabilities that are baked into the DBMS that'll let us be able to bring this back at any given point in time when the last backup was performed. All right. And we can take this stuff, we can copy it to other systems, we can move things without impacting, and there's a whole bunch of different things we can do with this backed up data. But the backup actually becomes a pretty big part of your operational structure, your operational support, making sure things are backed up, making sure it can be recovered, testing it, verifying it. on an ongoing basis. A couple different ways that you back things up. One is what we call a full backup, which basically it's everything that's out there. So it's all the data, it's all the files, all the structures, and when you recover it, so the full backup is everything. One of the challenge, though, a lot of times is if you've got a large database, multi-terabyte database, multi-petabyte database, as we're starting to get into that realm, being able to do a full backup can be actually challenging. It can take a lot of time because ultimately it's you're copying. Backups are you're copying stuff from one system to the other. So we've seen a lot of different approaches around this stuff. There's a couple different approaches that historically we've used, what we call differential backup. So the idea is you take a full backup one day, and then over a period of a couple days you would do differential backup. So you don't do a full backup every day. You do a full backup, then do either a differential backup, which is data has changed since the last backup, or you do an incremental backup, which only contains stuff that's been changed since the last full or incremental backup. So it's really you have a couple different approaches. Usually what you'll see is a combination of full and differential and incremental backups. So it's not a matter of, well, we only do one, or usually at minimum you got to do a full backup at least some point. All right. You might not have the luxury of being able to do a full backup for everything all the time. So you need to kind of weigh where differential and incremental backups are going to come into play. The recovery techniques, this is basically baked into the database management system, the DBMS. All right, so as we talked about before, part of what these systems will do is they'll maintain logs as we make changes. It'll log everything before and after the stuff is stored in another file, and they can be used to bring things back. So what we can do is, if we take up an image, if we take a backup up to say a full backup, and then we run the system for 4 or 5 days, and we're collecting all of these logs. What will happen is we get, like, say, day 3. What we would do is we would we would first start by restoring the full backup, from as our starting point, and then we would apply all of these, updates from the transaction logs, which would then bring it back up to a certain particular point in time. We can actually bring these things. We can restore a database back to a state where it was like minutes before the problem occurred. All right, so we can be stuff's gotten pretty sophisticated. All right, a lot of this stuff is done, and once again, the way this stuff is done is all part and parcel of the way the database. This is all functions of the innards of the database, how the databases do these things. We do different scenarios. We just talk about some of the scenarios. Do a full backup, restore. A lot of times what you do is you do a full backup to get the baseline, and then you'll do a differential and then transaction logs to bring it up to whatever point you need to get to. This whole process, all these things that have to be done, this is all within the domain of the database administrator. So they have the responsibility for designing it and implementing it and executing it. Other things database administrators, part of the administration side, performance monitoring. It's nothing worse than a slow database. All right? You get everybody's full undivided attention very quickly if you don't have performance. So part of what the DBA does, database administration does, is really to monitor what's happening and to try to maintain as efficient execution as possible. So we measure things like, the uptime, how long has the database been running. We measure things like the performance, how long does it take to execute things. Are there, is something running slow? Is something running slow? Something running slow that we can make adjustments for and correct. So we're always looking. So database administrators are always looking at, the status of the database, trying to take the measurements of what's happening, performance, how many queries per second is being done, what's running fast, what's running slow, things of that nature. All part and parcel of this whole performance monitoring. So there's some stuff some best practices that are associated with this around indexes. It's an art, so the idea, that index and index design is really as much of an art as it is a science. Understanding kind of what's going on, what's the actual behaviors, and then kind of translating it into a design, index design to get your best possible performance. And then also being able to do, this idea of tuning queries. So a lot of what gets done is always looking at what's going on, how data is changing. Because what will happen is things change over time. We add more data into a table. So we start off with, say, 100 entries in a table, and then you come back a month later and you got 1,000,000 entries. So it is okay now. What might that do in terms of performance if you're changing from reading 100 records to reading 1,000,000 records? So there's a bunch of different things that are kind of at a database administrator has at their disposal they can work with. But as I said, it's both art and science to do that. And that really is everything we need to know about database administration.